Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And, of course, those watching online are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post the program on our homepage for everyone's future reference. I will mention that the Terrorist Argument book is available in the lobby, and as they've pointed out, these are pre-release copies. It's actually going to be available in January, so those that are interested in the topic will want to pick them up today because they will not be commercially available until next month. Leading our discussion is James Phillips, Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. He is a veteran foreign policy specialist who has written widely on Middle Eastern security issues and international terrorism since joining us in 1979. He has testified before Congress on several terrorism issues, including Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the Iranian terrorist situation. An electronic file to be very interested in a footnote for your biographies of his congressional testimony on the evolving threat of Al-Qaeda was found on Osama bin Laden's computer by Navy SEALs after the May 2011 raid on his compound in Pakistan. So we do know that Jim's work gets very wide distribution. Please join me in welcoming Jim Phillips. Jim?
Well, thank you, John. We're fortunate today to have a very distinguished terrorism expert to talk about his new book, as John said. Dr. Chris Harmon wrote his PhD dissertation on terrorism in 1984 at the Claremont Grad School, and he's been teaching and publishing in this field ever since. As far back in 1988 to 1992, he was at the Naval War College. From 1993 to 2007 at Marine Corps University. Then he moved to the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies from 2007 to 2010, back to Marine Corps University, where he was the Major General Matthew Horner Distinguished Chair of Military Theory from 2010 to 2014. Currently, he's a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asian Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii, but he's on leave, and he's speaking here today as an independent scholar. In 2004, he wrote a backgrounder for the Heritage Foundation, still up on our website, that opened up the discussion in Washington of how terrorist groups end. And this is the first analysis that I know of on this subject, and it's become a cottage industry since then, and there's a whole new slew of articles on ISIS and speculating on how and when or if that will end. His lectures on this topic of terrorism and how terrorist group ends were given at the Pentagon, on Capitol Hill, the Woodrow Wilson Center here in town, and at Interpol headquarters in Lyon, France. He has presented several of his new books here, including A Citizen's Guide to Terrorism and Counterterrorism in 2014. And he's written recently articles in the journal Orbis and in Oxford Bibliographies. His newest book, written with Randall Bowdish, is The Terrorist Argument, Modern Advocacy and Propaganda, and we'll be selling them at a reduced rate out in the hallway after this talk. It's a very original and a deep study of the terrorist strategic communications and media campaigns, and will be released next month. Oh, Chris, I'll give it to you.
Thank you and good morning. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'll anticipate some good questions and discussion. Terrorism is about power. It's a perverse, twisted form of communication as well as power. And so part of the power in terrorism is the power of its communications. And to succeed, terrorists really do have to, in their own crude way, make their mark in politics. They have to forcefully put their ideas out in front of multiple audiences, both internal and external. And without those kinds of acts, without the words that combine with the acts, it would be a barren enterprise. But in fact, the combination of actions and words gives them their results. So the point is that they make arguments, and thus the choice of title for the book. And I learned a long time ago that it's much better to take their arguments seriously and to think them through than it is to dismiss them, which is what some do. The man who shot up Paris in November 2015, Abdelhamid Abaoud, did not just sort of turn up there. He was there, he did reconnaissance, he went back to Syria. He was cocky enough, and ISIS was cocky enough to give him a full interview in their magazine Dabiq. And that ran 9 months before his terror rampage in Paris. So he had to get back into Europe from Syria, where he'd given that interview. But they thought it was important enough to do that. I'll show you his picture a little bit later. In my research, I found an astounding variety of strategic communications used by terror groups. I'm only going to look at 7 today. And what we did in the book is choose a group and then pair it with a particular form of media. So today, when I speak of them, I'll mention the group, I'll mention the form of media they're most identified with, and then thirdly, in each section, I'll try to say something about the influence, I think, that group and media have had. So the 7 are radio, newspaper, speech making, television, the book, the internet magazine, and the advertisement. I won't do today social media, although that's in the book, because frankly I find you already know a lot about social media and ISIS and so forth. In fact, you may know much more than I do. So I'm going to begin with radio and with this brilliant man, Franz Fanon. Some of the older of you will remember him. He was not an Algerian, but he became a famous symbol of that revolution against French power, which succeeded in 1962. FLN was nationalist and secular. They were not Salafi extremists, and in fact, they shouldered aside any hard religious factions as they did any other political rivals, or they absorbed them individually into the National Liberation Front. They had an 8-point program. They announced it early, they stuck to it, and about 8 years later, they entirely succeeded. They advertised that they were anti-colonialist, which they were, and that they intended to rule Algeria afterwards in a different way, which they did come to do. They were important in the country and important in France and outside the country during the war. So their publicity was very important to garnering support. FLS nationalist ideology had a real international flair. They had an underground in France. They used diplomats. In fact, there's a major study of their diplomacy published by Oxford in 2002. They had foreign allies in large numbers. They had a newspaper. They had Franz Fanon, this man who wrote for their newspaper, El Mujahid, and also wrote some texts for their radio, although they did not, he did not broadcast. They had a radio called The Voice of Algeria. Fanon wrote a long essay, extremely thoughtful, about the origins of that Radio Algeria and why it was so good and why it was effective. He had a great influence, and it's a fine piece of work, and it's utterly forgotten. So much of my chapter is devoted to sort of reviving the careful study he made in that. FLN learned from France. France had used radio as a way to spread their cultural influence and impact. FLN flipped that over and began using new technologies involving things like mobile transmitters or transmitters placed outside Algeria and transistor radios. And so you would get in a remote village square somewhere during the fight, a single cafe radio perhaps turned up so that all could listen, or you would have the transistor in the field. They were able then to reach into remote areas, and the words had great power. And it was something to be here over this little new technology in a very distant place. This is the voice of fighting Algeria, or this is the voice of free Algeria. The influences were many. Lots of later groups would adopt their own radio programs and stations. We just don't read much about them, but they had them. The Tamil Tigers is one good example. And the influence of the group's success, too, was profound. There were many, many visitors who went to study how it was that the FLN had defeated a power like France, one of the victors of World War II, one of the bedrock states in NATO, an important role in the United Nations, all defeated by this very rather small guerrilla army and its international support systems. So the way that they succeeded was taken to be an augury of the future, and some parts of that are tied to radio. Fanon himself is now largely forgotten, except the occasional graduate student who gets interested, and everyone's heard the title, The Wretched of the Earth, but again, he wrote many good things, and one of the essays is this lost one about the impact of radio. His role is extremely important as a propagandist and as an alternate to other kinds of possibilities. This is one of the options. There's nothing determinative that makes an insurgency choose terror. This man is Farhad Abbas. He was a respectable nationalist who toiled for years in the underground trying to get the revolution going, and he had less success than the FLN. So he was brought into the FLN and in fact somewhat used as window treatment by the movement because he was a moderate and he was respected. But there was an other side of the movement which deliberately chose terrorism. And Martha Crenshaw's scholarship shows us how and when they made that strategic choice. And so moderates like Farhad Abbas, although very useful to the movement, were not at the center of its strategy making. So FLN left a legacy of argument and action, and they left a legacy of debate about the subject of terrorism, and they, in fact, decided that for multiple reasons, this was a good strategic tool. It was quite a calculated choice they made to be not just insurgents, but also to be terrorists. Subsequent groups, including our friends in ISIS, have found radio to be extremely useful, and often programs were offered in multiple languages. So it's quite common, in fact, now to have an insurgent radio stations. And it has been common since the 1950s with people like Chin Peng in the Malayan underground, or with the FLN, which we just explored. Here's my second medium, a newspaper, most interesting newspaper. The Irish Republican Army, of course, has roots that go way back. You can tie them to sentiment about nationalism going back hundreds of years, or the more usual is to say of the IRA that they're founded in the middle of World War I and associated with famous names like James Connolly and Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins. Their policy was for a unified Ireland. And their strategies over the years included guerrilla warfare, propaganda, deliberately chosen terrorism, sabotage bombings, sometimes executions of named enemies, very discreet and direct kinds of terrorism, or indiscriminate too. One of their archetypes was their good propaganda, and this paper, the Irish paper, is one that I read for 10 years and found it incredibly instructive about propaganda, about the Irish nationalist cause, about American links with events in Ireland. It was a very interesting study. They had lots of papers, the Irish did, over time, and this is just one, and it's one that was published in New York, not in Ireland. And that makes it extremely interesting. Their politics were such that they supported the violent cause, but then were able always to do so in a rather calm and cerebral way sometimes. Nothing illegal in most cases about publishing a paper. You could give a check to these guys with a fairly clear conscience and not be certain about where the money would go, but be confident that militancy might be supported by it, but it wasn't illegal. Now material support laws are strengthened, and it would be probably illegal, but they published for years without it being so. And it was a balanced and successful and very clever newspaper, I found. And you know, newspaper is extremely important. We all, even in digital days, think that the local paper is useful to a community. And we remember that people like Alexis de Tocqueville, who came here from abroad, were fascinated by Americans' interest in newspapers and the way they built a sense of community around so many themes. So he saw, the founders of this saw the value of it. The paper begins in the early 70s. This is one shot from November of 1973. And then later, another shot from a subsequent era. The paper had rather low production values. That won't really surprise us. It doesn't really seem important either. It could be a little murky, but the print and the color photographs and all were good enough, and the writing was good enough. It was reaching a diaspora, a very wide one in the United States. You know how many have Irish blood in the U.S. A person who's interested in linguistics or culture or art might find something in there, lots on politics and a little bit on military matters. So they have a section called War News, for example, which would update you on what they're doing. And some of it was quite cocky in the way it would describe events taking place. They weren't limited to that, though, so they might also discuss political debates, even suggestive of tensions within the IRA movement about whether or not to use the Armalite or the ballot box, their famous formulation. And of course, the strategy of the movement in most periods was to do both. And it was a fairly successful strategy, although ultimately their policy objective will not be fulfilled. They did sales long before some of the fascinating modern groups that are always using video. They produced plenty for sale, which you could buy. And they had simpler mechanisms for things like T-shirts. And so there I was in Dublin once in the office of Sinn Féin, buying an IRA T-shirt, which advertised the linkage between their fight and that in Colombia between Marxist guerrillas of FARC. It was quite interesting. There was a particular, in 3 men portrayed on the shirt that I bought, and it showed the movement's linkages. And they were later caught in Colombia, and then even after that disappeared. And it was an important chapter in internationalism between the two groups. So that paper was important, and in fact, lots of other newspapers have been important since then. We could take any number of groups like the American Weathermen and look at some of their publications. There's a strong trend in groups to publish a paper, and it's a very powerful thing for them. It allows them to control content. It allows them to put themselves out publicly on various positions. And it's, in fact, it can even be considered an interactive medium, given that you could always write to the editor or perhaps help with a story, and underground groups did that. This is the third medium, the world's simplest. This is a chapter on the human voice. So you see before you the architect of the New People's Army in the Philippines. Lots of terrorism books ignore most of Asia. This man's really important, although he doesn't live in Asia. He lives in Holland. But given the way things are in media, he's quite able to reach back into his chosen country. Jose Maria Sison founded the movement in the end of the 1960s. Communism has a tradition in the Philippines in the 20th century. A couple of parties came and went, and he refounded the Communist Party with a Maoist tendency at the end of the 60s. He has been very important. He has been very loquacious. He's trained a lot of people, and he continues to write and publish all the time. His organization grew and was at once very powerful, and since then now quite weak. There were at one time, so perhaps 24,000 of the guerrillas, but then far more supporters who did things like propagandize, right? And so now the group is probably down to maybe 3,000 to 4,000 guerrillas, not very important. This map, and again, it was wonderful to have the support of Darren Fazzino, who's here working on this chapter, but also Tom and Jordan Saunders, who were kindly the beneficiary. I was the beneficiary of the chair at Marine Corps University where this work was done. We matched a data set to geography and were able to sort of show visibly how NPA's concentrations are. And it's a bit surprising, these results. For example, we don't really expect to see them in the South, which we associate with Islamic influence. But in fact, these Maoists have a great deal of power in the Southeast in the country. And we also tend to expect to see them up north in Luzon, where the old Haq Balahap were, for example, in the 1950s. And they aren't very strong there at all. So it was a useful enterprise, and it shows us that they intend to conquer, if they're lucky, the whole nation. It's an internationalist group with a national focus about bringing communist power to the Philippines. And they have not been terribly successful, but their strategic communications are oriented in the direction of winning power over the country you see in front of you. So their guerrilla training goes on, and so does their ideological training. Sison himself makes music albums. He writes poems. He writes long speeches. He makes broadcasts on satellite TV. He goes to international conferences. He republishes his old books. He writes new things. He's a very, very active propagandist and an exceedingly important person. Down at the micro level, in the jungle camps of these folks, his work then is very important. And the work of the great helmsman, Mao Zedong, is still venerated where in a way that it is not even in China. Sison, I think, is significant for lots of reasons by way of his influence. He remains argumentative, polemical. He remains a leader of the far left. This is the year of the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution, so even though he's a Maoist, he predictably turned out some pretty long speeches glorifying Lenin's accomplishment and what had happened in Russia. He contributes to current affairs with a kind of Maoist analysis of economics in the Philippines. He has been extremely active in trying to influence opinion. He runs a little, at a distance, a newspaper is run within the Philippines called Ang Bayan, which is probably one of your best sources for understanding what NPA's political issues are. So the propaganda that they do is extremely important. And it is very valuable to read and study that which they do turn out for that reason. In terms of his influence, I think it's not just confined to the left, but it also can be studied in a more general way, considering the power that oratory has and the power of a charismatic leader, which can be carried by modern communications to almost anywhere in the world. So Sison remains, although aged now, a creative and important influence on the far left. And in fact, he recently founded a whole new international organization to advertise his material. Another medium, television. Hezbollah. Hezbollah is famous for lots of things, and what I want to talk about today is Al-Manar TV. Television is a great way to carry your message, obviously, and if you have strong speakers and intelligent arguments to offer, you can expect you'd not just limit it to a small audience, but you'd use modern media to carry it. This group, around since the beginning of the 80s, has gotten ever stronger. They're 3.5 decades old. They are a political kingmaker of sorts within Lebanese politics. They control the votes and ideological inclinations of lots of people in country and out. Their terrorism has taken them to places like southern Argentina and Burgas, Bulgaria, Bangkok, lots of other places. It's a group that's a guerrilla group, a terrorist group, a political group, a humanitarian group, and everything else. And as you can see, they're quite serious about moving from mere guerrilla status into something more formal as a military organization. Well, they have a TV station, Al-Manar, and it's quite fascinating to read some of the transcripts that have appeared on it. And my partner, Randy Bodish, did a close analysis of a lot of the years of broadcasting by Al-Manar. It means the beacon, and that's a good indicator right there that they want to grab your attention. They've scored some early propaganda hits, such as setting up a trap for Israeli defense forces, filming a bunch of them coming ashore and getting shot up in an amphibious operation, which they foiled, and then turning that film into a loop, which ran continuously on Al-Manar TV for months afterwards. They understand propaganda, and they've been highly successful. They aren't limited to that kind of footage. They have social commentary, political shows, things aimed at children, informational programs, and it's all told quite a sophisticated television organization. Here's one of the series of shots they've done for a program for kids. Mickey Mouse, this is not. What they serve up here is a kind of 21st century iconography for Shia. Some of these pictures are really good. There are some stone slingers on the left, for example, and gorillas on the top right. I think my favorite is the lovely silhouetted horse at the lower right, a kind of motif that Al-Qaeda people like a great deal too. Good quality, very attractive, and as I say, a kind of iconographical effort. Here's some more screen captures from Al-Manar TV. Young girl, I don't know what, 7, 8, 9 years old. Your guess is good. A very animated speech here, probably difficult for you to read, but she says that Palestine is calling to you and Jerusalem is calling to you, that Jerusalem is captive now. The phrase, it's interesting, given the news in the papers. And meanwhile, what are you doing? The slumber has lasted too long, and inactivity is preventing the conquest of Jerusalem by Hezbollah and others. So reason is asleep, and reason can't be trusted anyway, so listen to us and follow is effectively the message here. Hezbollah has lots of other kinds of propaganda, a variety of print publications, a radio station. They have this theme park for kids where you can go see about their conquests of Israeli platforms. But their main influence in terms of running the TV station has been, I think, important. It has got a importance that reaches far beyond Lebanon. Once programs like that are made, they can be captured and rerun in any kind of country. Cable TV can extend their reach. There's parts of the non-Lebanese world where coverage has been quite possible to listen to, depending on transmission strength. It's a way to summon donations. It's a way to recruit. It's a way to refute lies about the organization or propagandize for the organization. And it's been very important. Now, is there influence from this? Can Al-Manar TV really be said to be copied by other groups? I think the answer would be they try when they can. ISIS had some television for a while once it captured studios in Mosul and other places. Most groups do not have the deep pockets that Hezbollah has. They don't have Iranian direct assistance. They don't have the widespread system for getting donations maybe that Hezbollah does. So many groups are enabled to do something as complicated as TV. One of the alternatives has been to make fixed programs and then offer them to a cable station, which can be done. And the Kurdish Workers' Party, for example, used to do that in Europe. And it's one of the ways that television's power was evident, even though, for example, there was no formal fixed brick-and-mortar station for PKK. For a while, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka had a TV station. It ran for several years, and a journalist told me it was quite good, too. And of course, if you don't have even the ability to do a fixed spot and sell it to a cable station, you can still use the power of TV if you do interviews. And so all the terror leaders I've studied have done interviews, and some are quite adept. They're very comfortable talking publicly and very comfortable in a one-on-one interview with important journals. And they do that, and it allows them to, at no expense, literally zero, to get their views out to a large public. And of course, it's then given the credibility of whatever newspaper or TV station they're talking to. We come now to another form of terrorism that's not usually mentioned in terms of media and communications. There are lots of terrorists who write books. Surprising. Ingo Hasselbach was one of the important German neo-Nazis for a while, did a very good book. Several of the Palestinians are famous for books. This is Abu Musab al-Suri, a real man of mystery. He's not only an author, but a real teacher of terrorists. He penned a lot of things over time. He did a book on Afghanistan, for example, which I've read. He's done almost every other kind of media you can think of. And he's most known for a 1,600-page book called The Call to Global Islamic Resistance. I was recently watching a program over at CSIS on cable TV, and they were joking that probably nobody really reads this book except terrorism analysts. And I'm going to argue that's not true. It's not true. I think lots of people have been reading it. Al-Suri is kind of a paradox. I can't swear to you that he's alive today. We haven't seen him for a very long time, but we also haven't any evidence of his death. He remains incredibly influential because of his book, which was written and then released over the internet. There's a nice photograph of him only released a few years ago with the man himself there in Tora Bora. He knew bin Laden personally, but he was never a member of Al-Qaeda. I should say, too, he's not a member of ISIS. There's an academic that's published an article in the last year saying how important he is to the doctrine of ISIS. I think that's wrong. And in fact, in ISIS magazines I've seen, they actually are critical of Abu Musab al-Suri. He is, however, incredibly important to Al-Qaeda and to this whole new school of activity in your own country without foreign travel, individual jihad. This is quite a photograph. It's really a remarkable picture of two very important men. Now, terrorism is only one of the topics that's discussed in the Call to Global Islamic Resistance. That's why the book's so important. It's a book about policy, history, strategy, tactics, justifications of all kinds. It's a book that emphasizes the need to build a strong media presence. They did that in his time, and Al-Qaeda's done that, of course. It's a book in which terrorism has a particular place, but in a larger structure. What frightened people like Lenin about terrorism is it would be unchained, it would be unregulated, it would be misused. Al-Suri is very clear that if in the right structure, in the right circumstances, terrorism is an incredibly important weapon. That's worth underscoring. There's a lot of academics that always dismiss the idea that any of the terrorists would admit to terrorism. In fact, Al-Suri does, and lots of others do, if we pay close attention. And so he argues for terrorism as well as guerrilla war. So the Call to Global Islamic Resistance is one of these very important books you may never have heard of. It's kind of like Mein Kampf, except I think it's more intelligent than Mein Kampf was. It's a very influential book, and there are only parts of it that have been made available in translation. The best way to find out how significant it is and to get its tenor is to look at Inspire magazine. And in that Al-Qaeda publication, they routinely reprint Al-Suri essays about terrorism. That's important. They didn't routinely reprint bin Laden They sometimes would reprint al-Zawahiri, but not that often. The thing they reprinted most, issue after issue, when that started in 2010, Inspire, was essays by this man on the right, al-Suri. So he's an extremely important fellow, and since Inspire magazine has literally been in the side baggage of many known terrorists, that matters. Other books that have come out of a totally different stripe, here's one that's really from a different world. Adele Ann is the author. That's Balasingham. She is the wife of a very important diplomat for the Tamil Tigers. The diplomat's dead now. She's not. I'm told she's in Australia. This is a book about the role that women fighters should have within the Tamil Tigers, that important Sri Lankan organization destroyed only in 2009 after a 35-year run. You can pull this up on the web. Anyone can read it. It's maybe 35 pages long. And it defines the cultural and political and military necessity of having women involved in the fight. And as you know from observing that organization, they had a lot of guerrilla units that were female. They had mixed units as well. So Adele Balasingham has been a very important person. And others have followed that theme. So there's several of her recruits, if you like, with a captured vehicle. One man, lots of young women with sidearms and rifles. And here is another similar pitch, another similar sized booklet done by ISIS and translated by the Quilliam Foundation in London. This one will tell you, if you're a lady, how to be a good lady within ISIS and the organization's approach to you, to culture, to religion, to politics, why you should emigrate from wherever you are to join the new state, and what you can do to contribute to ISIS. It's another booklet-sized thing which has been notable and which can also be readily found on the web. So those are just a few examples of all the publications they've done by way of books and monographs, but there are far more, I think, than are ever reflected in usual textbooks on terrorism. One scholar did a research and said he'd found 106 volumes, in fact, which had all been written by individual terrorist leaders. So there's quite a lot out there if you want to study original sources, and I know that I certainly do. This is something you know a lot about now, so it'll be hard for me to be very interesting, but this is Inspire magazine, issue 1, with the most famous article about making a bomb in your mom's kitchen. A glossy magazine, 16 issues appeared, although it's stopped now. Every one of them well worth reading, extremely interesting in terms of politics, psychology, and direct approaches to Americans and Westerners. Supposedly done by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but also clearly a mouthpiece for Central Al-Qaeda. It ran up through mid-2016 before it stopped. So you see the slogan here, "May our souls be sacrificed for you." And the source of that quote is Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American who was an editor of this journal. There were interviews in Inspire. There were bomb-making features. There are a lot of essays on assassination as a tactic, which they advise, especially to individuals, which is a great way to act if you follow those ideas and can't get to one of their training camps or something. And you see there within the page to your left, there's actually one of the articles is where the bylines are. He names himself as the terrorist. So again, no embarrassment about the word itself. And in fact, all those al-Suri sections I mentioned appearing in Inspire, frequently using the word terrorism. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what strategic choice they're making. I've tried to look at the artwork and poems in this magazine, and I come away from most of those studies quite impressed with the quality of it. It deteriorated a very little bit after some of the editors died, but it was to the end a very worthy magazine. Much better in terms of imagination and tone, I think, than anything done by ISIS. A very exemplary piece of terrorist propaganda. I think the influence of it is evident by the numbers of individual terror acts that are tied directly to this magazine. In my research, I've found 4 or 5 at least. And I think Scott Shane's book for the New York Times, he did a nice book on Anwar al-Awlaki. There's a list of those in there too, where an individual terror incident is directly tied to the influence of that particular magazine. Okay? Now, they did a lot of interesting things. You've all been grimacing from time to time when you've seen discussions of how ISIS thinks about women. And what I want to say here is it's kind of like reading about terrorism. If you expect embarrassment, you can forget that. They're quite confident here in telling you exactly what they think. Some of the articles are extremely difficult to actually get yourself through. This one is praise of slave taking as a reward for those who are successful in war. There's a passage for you. And when you think that your meter for impudence is just about topped out, you can also find an estimate here for what the slave market value might be for Michelle Obama. So moral provocations are kind of a hallmark for ISIS. The magazine Inspire had its own high standards. And this is Dabiq. This is the magazine Dabiq, which is remarkable in many, many respects. Now, this is the man I mentioned at the beginning, the manager of the massacre in November of 15 in Paris. And it's extremely interesting to see him portrayed here many, many months before he re-entered Europe to conduct that operation. So he is rather pleased with himself in these pictures, and in fact, I'm sure will be regarded as one of the more successful international terrorists of all time, given the death tallies in Paris. It's quite striking. This picture appeared, in part anyway, in the Honolulu Star-Advertiser, and I said, geez, I've seen that before. And so after Paris, I was able to go back to this issue of Dabiq, which was sitting on my desk, and get the interview material he'd given 9 months before. So as for those of us who are interested in security issues, or those who might be trying to do policing or intelligence, we're reminded again of how incredibly useful it is to read the primary sources of these enemy organizations, because with these kinds of pictures available, European security officers might have done better at catching him before Paris. He boasts in the article, Allah chose me to travel to Europe in order to terrorize the Crusaders waging war against the Muslims. And then he did. Now, this is another group, and it's the last one I'm looking at today, before I take your questions. And this is the People's Mujahideen. We've dealt with a number of different ideologies today. These are secular Iranian dissidents. And their organization goes back. Many of these groups last a long time, didn't they? NPA, 50 years. This group was founded in 1965. It was founded in opposition to Iran's government. And then as government changed in Iran, especially in 78, 9, they continued in opposition. They ended up on the side of Saddam Hussein and had conventional weapons he provided. They ended up with their own encampments, and they were a kind of surrogate for the Iraqis. They went that far in being anti-Iranian, but they are Iranian dissidents. They are not religious in character. It's a secular organization, often called Mujahideen-e-Khalq or People's Mujahideen, PMOI or MEK. They're an extremely interesting organization. Why would I talk about them today? They ran an absolutely unique publicity campaign in your newspapers, if you'll remember. This is one of the many, many ads which appeared in places like the Washington Post, the Washington Times, the International Herald Tribune, the New York Times. From '05 onward, and especially in latter years up till 12, they routinely ran large, very expensive print ads in newspaper. Now, it's fascinating because the woman who runs this organization, Maryam Rajavi, has done satellite TV. She's a very gifted speaker. She holds international conferences. She travels some, at least in places where it was legal to do so. They have a wide propaganda effort, but she chose the medium of print in newspaper for this campaign. The campaign had many angles and variants. This is a young girl who fears for her life because Iraq authorities might be unpleasant with her after the Iraq controlled the area around their camps. There are others such as this, which appealed very directly to Americans, which said took a different angle. If you look at the names on that list, you see a remarkable group of people: a former national security advisor, various retired generals, recent directors of FBI, CIA, a former head of the State Department's counterterrorism team. These people were enlisted in these conferences, made speeches about Iranian affairs, Iraqi affairs, and then they were used in effect in these propaganda campaigns by MEK. They have a headquarters in France now. It's well appointed, and they have money, and this is the way they chose to spend some of their money. So this campaign was something I watched for a long time. It went on and on, year after year. The ads were rich in text many times, sometimes dominated by a certain picture or two. They were resourceful about the themes they chose, and in the end, they won their campaign to be delisted. So they'd been on the U.S. list of terror groups for many, many years. They kept arguing they should be taken off, and finally they were. What's their influence? Well, at first, I'd say one of the influence factors to be mentioned is a good one. They proved, in effect, that a group can come off the U.S. list, that the U.S. government is indeed flexible enough to recognize what has happened. They quit terrorism probably in about early '01. They commenced a political offensive. They said, in effect, we've transitioned into a political group. Some studies of how terror groups end emphasize that some groups do that. It's not very usual. Some do. This is one. It's one of the latest. And they successfully, by lobbying in Congress and with this campaign and in other ways, removed themselves from the State Department list, which is really quite a striking achievement. You can run your own newspaper like the Irish People, or you can just buy space in someone else's. And either way, you get to write the ad copy, and nobody can interfere editorially. And then, in fact, if you've printed something in the New York Times or the International Herald Tribune, you can then reprint that. You can run it on your own websites. You have, in effect, partaken of the legitimacy of that established media entity. So there's advantages to running your own paper, but there's advantages as well to simply using someone else's. And I'm going to leave you there now with just a very few conclusions, and I look forward to your questions. Terrorism is, in fact, very purposeful activity, and it's wedded with thought. And the nervous system is one target by terrorists, and the body is another target, but the brain is a third, and all three matter. They're all targeted in terror campaigns. The second point really is that ideas matter. Ideas and arguments matter. Ideas can kill. And there are many books like the Turner Diaries or The Call to Global Islamic Resistance, which we can tie directly to killings. And the third point would just be, I think we've underestimated how rich is the array of terrorist propaganda. It runs from rural skits, guerrilla theater, if you like, that insurgents do, like NPA, all the way through highly, highly sophisticated things like internet websites, where, by the way, you can still download something as complex as a 1,600-page book or a simple one-page visual picture. So media are varied. They partake of many of them. And one of the most interesting things I learned was that a more very sophisticated group, just because it has money and control of, say, satellite TV access, may not choose that medium in which to propagate its ideas. They tend not to abandon the older media, but to simply add that to their arsenal, do the high-tech stuff, but also do a lot of the older material as well. And with that, Jim, I'll turn it over to you or anybody else with questions.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to ask the first question, then I'll turn it over to the audience to ask questions. And when you do, I just ask that you can identify yourself and then your affiliation, or you could just say private citizen, and then ask a very short question. And I'll just ask you a very short question right now. I think one of the strengths of this book is that I think it really focuses on what's important in the long run in the struggle against these kind of terrorist ideologies, and that is the focus on the war of ideas rather than the war on the battlefield. And I think our government does a lot better at fighting the war on the battlefield than the war of ideas. And I'm wondering, what recommendations would you make to, say, Washington policymakers as to how to either block the dissemination of this propaganda or refute it or discredit it? How could they do a better job of that?
Yes, although this is more a kind of fruits of research speech than a policy speech, I do think it has a lot of policy implications. We learn right away in all things military to fully understand our enemy. According to Sun Tzu, that's probably the most important thing you can do. And I think serious study of the propaganda is one of the things that we often neglect. And not someone like you, but many analysts, many journalists, many social scientists do neglect the original sources. And I think we need to have recourse to those on a regular basis. They're often far more instructive than, say, textbooks about a problem. Look at the enemy very directly and try to understand what he is. Only when we've done that do we appreciate the range of arguments being offered and then can start thinking about how to counter violent extremism. I think of the efforts I see by different governments and different private entities, and there are plenty of those involved, they can do more to better understand the enemy so that they can better shape arguments against them. That's one thing. There's some trickier questions about whether to let this kind of propaganda run or whether, in fact, to censor it. Censorship is an extremely difficult thing, so we're always careful. But when we look at foreign countries, we do see that it's quite common. It's quite not so common, but almost every country has individual political parties which it has banned. So you can do a lot of things in Austria, but you can't found a neo-fascist party and talk about the seizure of power in Vienna. And there's very good reasons for that. Proscribed parties are not so rare. So states have that, and states are also looking at hate crime legislation too. And so there are certain times when a state will weigh in with respect to that which can be published. So it's well understood that you can write almost anything, but when you get to open inciting rebellion based upon those doctrines, then those you've wedded action and thought in ways that are dangerous. And so states do have a role in some times. Certain things, I believe, like, say, bomb recipes in an Inspire magazine could easily be doctored just a bit so that they don't work. Where we could still study the propaganda, but maybe not be passing along to the local college kid a correct recipe for bomb making. In psychological operations in the field, armies and intelligence agencies can think about options for what I call warping this kind of propaganda, or effectively keeping it on the street or producing versions of it which are actually have kind of adjusted messages which are powerful means of competition. So that, for example, a purported dissident paper or something like that. So there are some very concrete ways that this pays off. But I think the most important thing is to fully understand the arguments. And so when you've done that, You have other options that are open to you simply in public diplomacy, right? So let's say that, as always happens, you're a scholar of the Middle East, a very important group, a conclave of religious leaders in Islam assembles, as they often do, and passes an anti-terrorist fatwa or a profound document which analyzes a thing like an essay in Inspire or Dabiq and tears it apart based on Islam, based on logic, based on politics of moderation. We can do a lot to amplify that kind of result. And in fact, we don't. We really don't. Or we relegate it to certain bureaucracies within our government. What would it be like, in fact, if a president or a vice president or a chairman of one of the important committees were to give far more attention to such a document done by moderate Muslims who are condemning terrorism? There are long documents and short, and I've read many, probably less than you, which do that. And they are often greeted with silence in our government. And in fact, what frankly we should do is flip that over and start addressing it much more directly. And a Secretary of State could start a press conference on 5 items by making the first a publication of an important new a document by, say, Asian imams who object to the way that Abu Sayyaf and others use Islamic ideas and end up in terrorism. But in fact, we don't really compete in that way. We talk about the competition, but we really don't do it. And we could do much more of that. So those are sort of 3 or 4 ideas, I guess, which came to me out of this study.
And we'd just like to open it up to questions from the floor. If you could wait, Chris will recognize you, and just wait till the microphone comes so that our viewers online and future versions of this tape will be able to hear your question. Do we have any questions?
Yes, sir. In the middle there. Okay. Yep. One there and then second there. Great.
Hi, my name is Patrick O'Connor. I'm from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. In countering violent extremism, you've talked about the fact that public officials can speak out and endorse the more moderate views, but that sometimes has the kiss of death effect, where because the United States is endorsing these views, they lose credibility with certain audiences. Is this something that you've thought about, and how we can endorse local ones in a covert way so that we can amplify their message without necessarily hurting the credibility of these organizations?
Yes, I think that, for example, literally using that point I ended on, I doubt very much that it would be seen as damaging if, say, a Secretary of State or someone like that with that stature were to make clear the virtues of a new publication that's this directly involved after a particular terrorist attack, for example. The organization of the Islamic Conference, now called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, publishes almost annually very important refutations of terrorism. And when did you last hear a U.S. state mention it? I could go through many offices that have been silent, and many opportunities like the Mardan Declaration of 2010, which was a powerful, powerful thing, which our government seems to have ignored, and which most governments have ignored. So you're looking at a choice there, aren't you, in communication strategy? And I would just say that there's a kind of, that silence has been tried and it hasn't worked. And that what Jim said in his question is true and widely recognized in our town, that we've done brilliantly in some aspects of the war against terrorism and the fight with it. We've done badly in the contest of ideas. And it's because we aren't fighting, or almost none of us. That the offices that do this are small, the rotation in their leadership has been overdone, and that there's, in short, a lack of imagination about these things. And so you can assess it as a matter of sort of the reserve of office. Barack Obama, for example, was an incredibly articulate man, He had a rather sort of cool personality, and I don't think he wanted to be seen to be debating on a subject like this with, you know, Islamists and propagandists, right? But you pay a price for that kind of silence as well. You pay a price for that because it seems like you don't care very much, or only low-level bureaucrats care, or psychological operations people in the field care. And it's, in fact, should be a public discussion. And we're mistaken if we think we should disarm ourselves in this contest of ideas or wait for others to fill in where we don't have the voice or the courage to speak up. So that Mardan Declaration is never mentioned to me by anyone in any government anywhere, but it's terrific. It was a big conclave of theologians who met in Turkey 7 years ago, and they produced a great document. And do you know how I learned of it? Reading Inspire magazine. Because Anwar al-Awlaki read that, and he said, this is really disturbing stuff. This is a systematic attack on my ideology and my justification of violence. And so he did a point-by-point refutation in Inspire magazine, showing his intelligence, showing his seriousness about the contest of ideas. What did we do? Nothing. We never amplified the Mardan Declaration, and almost nobody I've ever talked to about it has even heard of it. And each year, documents like that appear. But I guess the real short answer to your question is, I understand the reserve in that position about not attributing these kinds of views to the U.S. government. But how's it worked for us so far? It hasn't. Yes, sir.
Hi, Carl Golovin, excuse me, domain reference and idealiveson.net. Thank you for being here. I'd ask if you could comment on what I would call false flag terrorism, or it deals with the concept of layers of deception in the way terrorism can be used to, by example, assets or agents of a nation state or entities such as NATO can be used to perpetrate events that will be brought about to demonize a preferred enemy. The book Operation Gladio by Dr. Paul L. Williams addresses terrorism of this nature that occurred in Europe during the Cold War. Also, Operation Northwoods, a Joint Chiefs of Staff proposal to Kennedy in the early 60s to incite, to bring the population of the U.S. into agreement that we needed to go to war with Cuba. False flag terrorism.
Well, I think that there are false flag terror operations, but not as many. I think I would almost say I'm going to resist your question in the way that the lecture really focuses on those who wave their ideas in the air at us. There's something remarkable about the boldness and the ubiquity of these arguments and the willingness to reinforce them with repeated publications, and the willingness to claim incidents and boast of it. And the archetype is not the false flag. The dangerous archetype today is the group that's so shameless that it hurls the homosexual off the top of a building and films it and then gives it to you, that burns a Jordanian pilot in a cage and then tells you with pictures exactly why they're doing it. So we both recognize these things may exist, but this is really kind of terrorism advertising rather than false flag, and that's the study that I've made. Is that what they say on the surface? And I guess the burden of my lecture is to show how remarkably important the surface is, maybe more than the subsurface. Interesting question. Yes, sir.
I'm Paul Guppy, private citizen. So is part of our message to Islamic audience to show that the tactic that these groups use in terrorism is counterproductive to the Islamic world by keeping them isolated and in poverty, preventing economic development, or even just participation in the global community? And does that work against these terrorist groups?
Yes, and I think that's right. And it isn't, there are variants on what we can and do say. And sometimes, for example, Michael Waller's made a study of this. A tool like ridicule can be useful Inspire magazine used it a lot. They used to ridicule Gaddafi before he died. They used to ridicule Saleh, he just died. They used to ridicule our presidents. That can be powerful, and wit can, in that sense, can be powerful. But the much more powerful thing is the strong and positive line. That in politics, a good, strong, positive message is really more key. Fascism had great strength, but it was an incredibly negative ideology in so many things. They were against so many things, and it was a little fuzzy about what they were for, except perhaps one race, and that excluded so much of the world. And it's essentially Achilles' heel weakness in that doctrine. We have, democracies have, Republican forms of government have, rule of law advocates have so much more to offer. And those are the kinds of themes that you really want to strike in your public diplomacy. And, civil society, rule of law, those are things that bring us all together. Those will bring them together at the UN, at the Organization of the Islamic Conference, at the next ASEAN meeting or NATO meeting. And then, yes, there's definitely a line of argument that is important about the destructiveness of terrorism. There are economic measures of it, and it's extremely costly. It does damage development. It does distort economies, and it probably spreads poverty. People think terrorism arises from poverty. Actually, there's no studies that show much connection. But it is clear that the terrorism wrecks things. When I was in Afghanistan in '06, I was able to confirm in interviews that the incredible pattern of Taliban burning of schools. So you'd have people from Seattle or New York building schools in some place in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and then you'd have Taliban burning it down. They did that for good reasons. They're announcing they don't want you there. They're announcing they're going to keep girls out of school. They're announcing that instead of foreign influence, you're going to have only Taliban influence. They're showing their contempt for the established elected Afghan government. Lots of good reasons that they set that fire, but the result is no school, and the girls stay home. And so there's a tremendous destructiveness to terrorism. And when journalists have asked me, and sometimes they do, I encourage them to look at the victims of terrorism, the damage of terrorism. In older days, in the Cold War, analysts in my field well understood the economic damage of terrorism. They understood the communist strategy of using economic damage. So you didn't surprise anyone when Sendero Luminoso in Peru is systematically knocking down power plants and lines everywhere. Or in Salvador, when the guerrillas front wrecked all the trains in El Salvador. People sort of understood that that's a kind of economic warfare that was very powerful. We kind of forgot about that, and then bin Laden reminds us, and among other places in the 1993 fatwa, in which he talks about doing economic damage. Inspire keeps that theme. The pages I've showed you didn't cover it, but there's remarkable consistency in Al-Qaeda for economic warfare. And it's their attempt to destroy their enemies. Now, you and I could say it's a misguided strategy and they're never going to defeat the economy of the United States, but I'm just saying in word and act, they sure are trying.
My name is Mitsuo Nakai. My question is, can you talk more about Abu Sayyaf and Mindanao? They are located there, as well as other Muslim groups, rebellion groups in Indonesia or even Malaysia.
Sure. Let's stay with the Philippines. Abu Sayyaf is an early partner of Al-Qaeda. It's always been a very strong group, but a very small group. Their prevalence is in the islands here. They are therefore in southwest Mindanao. We're reminded that there are a lot of Christians as well as Muslims in Mindanao, And we're reminded by the map that the NPA, who are atheists by profession, are in Mindanao. The president is from Davao City, which is over on the right side of that map on the east, and Abu Sayyaf has been on the left side in the islands. They are one of the most successful extortionist groups of modern times. They have many sources of income, and some even think they've been growing marijuana, but that's a questionable. But mostly what they do is kidnap for ransom. They've gone through highly religious and then less religious phases. It's difficult to generalize. They're formed by a group that, like bin Laden, has a profound view about the future of Mindanao and wants to see all good Muslims joined in a transnational thing called the Caliphate. They share that vision. But over time, some have dismissed them as a mere criminal organization, but in fact, they've continued as an attempt to be both an insurgent and a terror group. They've made tens of millions of dollars by extortion. They've spent a lot of that on further weaponry, fast boats, intelligence operations, communications methods, and have been attempting to flourish. They don't do the kind of thing I'm working on. They don't do much by way of publicity. They are active in discernible ways in taking hostages and in trying to link up with foreign powers that are interested in their same mission. Most of them remain Al-Qaeda, but there's a small faction that recently broke off and indicated interest in joining ISIS. They're not the primary group involved in the great fights of the last year in a place called Marwan City, they are in fact not one of the 3 or 4 major groups engaged in that long insurgency which recently ended. But they have mostly been a guerrilla presence in the jungle and active in foreign countries, as you've noted. But they don't do much by way of propaganda. Yes.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss, and I write for Front Page Magazine. I'm a lawyer, and I just want to say I thought your presentation was completely terrific. I really enjoyed it, and I was debating whether or not I should say something because I really do think it was great. I wrote a book on the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and I would just encourage you to revisit your position on them. They are not nearly as great. I hate to see someone with your credibility promoting them. They absolutely support Palestinian terrorism, and when they use the word terrorism, it's not the same as when we use it. You know, they support. I don't even know how to get into it, and I'm really tired, and it's your lecture. But all I can tell you is the language they use is not necessarily, you might mean one thing and they might mean another. They have this whole defamation of Islam campaign. Don't defame Islam. There's rarely a terrorist act, specific acts. You can just broadly say, I don't agree with terrorism, but specific acts they often support. So they say one thing and they do another. I guess that's the bottom line.
I'm happy to read it, the spelling your last name. Give me the spelling your last name.
W-E-I-S-S. My
Okay.
first name is Deborah, D-E-B-O-R-A-H. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Jihad on Free Speech. Sorry, I rambled.
Not at all. It's not a ramble. It's perfectly reasonable. These organizations are very often kind of softly political. I recommend we look at the positive they put out, not just the negative. OIC is fascinating because even a lot of the fellows I teach in my current job who come from Muslim countries don't really track them politically. They have less influence among those folks who come for studies than you'd think. They are reliable in their general posture. And so to me, I think of them in certain ways like I think of the United Nations, which used to ignore terrorism, still ignores a lot of it, but which has, through the Security Council mechanisms, and that's important, passed quite a lot of very powerful, useful resolutions. And so I see a transition in the UN from '99 onward, which I find favorable. OIC may have a long way to go, and I promise to be very reserved about my views on it. I do think that in general, they've been on the right side in some of the things they publish. I'll look closer. Thank you. Yes, sir. This will be the last question, I guess. Thank you.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Now that the U.S. is officially recognizing Jerusalem as capital of Israel, what changes do you see happening with propaganda that you think is on the horizon here? Yeah.
I'm going to ask Jim if he'd like to comment, because he's my go-to guy on the Middle East, and I'd be delighted to have him close with comments on that question. I'll say only this, that there's no question that it's seen as a battleground by the militants I study. Inspire magazine has some lovely, and I mean that, some lovely artwork which shows ranges and rows of men on the march to liberate Al-Aqsa or something else, and that it's the drive to fully recover all of Jerusalem is central to the kind of propagandists that I've studied. And so they will see this as an opportunity for lots of new agitation, I'm certain. But since I was going to leave the last word to Jim anyway, this is a perfect segue, because he knows the issue better than I.
Thanks, Chris. You know, I think that will be an issue they will try to cash in on, but they've been cashing in on that or exploiting that issue for a long time anyway. And I think you had a slide where one of the speakers said that Jerusalem was under occupation, and that this just isn't anti-Israeli propaganda. It's also aimed at Jordan, because they want to overthrow the king of Jordan, and he actually has administrative control over the holy places. So it's also implicitly an effort to undermine the Jordanian government, not just Israel. But I would argue that any terrorism that comes out of this was probably in the pipeline anyway, and that this Jerusalem issue was another pretext to rationalize an act that they were planning to do anyway. But we'll see what happens in the next few days. And with that, I'd like to thank you for some very interesting questions, and especially to thank Chris for a very illuminating talk, and just to tell the audience that we will have copies of the book outside, I believe, for sale at a special reduced price, and to talk to Chris out there. And will you be signing? Yes. He will also be signing it. And audience, if you could help me thank Chris for a very great talk. Thank you.